You're watching Beyond Market. Welcome, Mr. Awuni. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll discuss how African countries can build resilience to manage climate risks. You can join today's conversation with the hashtag Beyond Market, and you can send tweets to my Twitter handle too, at Esther O. Awuni. Now, according to the United Nations, disaster-hit countries suffered direct economic losses of over $2 trillion from climate-related disasters within 9 years, and Africa is one of the most vulnerable regions to natural disasters and the impact of climate change, despite contributing the least to global warming. Mohamed Beavogui, Director General, African Risk Capacity, joins me to discuss how to manage disaster risks. Mohamed, thank you for taking the time out to join us today. But let's start with you helping us or telling us what your assessment is on the current response to major climate-related disasters on the continent.
Esther, first of all, thank you for having me. Cyclone Idai is calling the international community, particularly Africa, to open its eyes on the reality of disaster risk management. As you have seen, a lot of effort is being done, not only by the government of those countries that are affected, but also by the international community. But still, the needs are much, much bigger than what is on the ground. So the reality that is coming on our eyes is that we need more preparedness, meaning that we need really in Africa to understand our risk profile vis-a-vis disaster risks. We need to have very good early warning systems, but we need to have good response plans and the means to finance those response plans. That means the financial resources.
Well, what we have seen is that, because I've heard some arguments that, these days, many African countries have competing priorities, especially in their annual budgets. There are, major sectors like, health, education, social infrastructure. If you just think about the gap, the infrastructure gap in Africa, it's a huge one. So that, many say, perhaps could be one of the reasons why we're not seeing the much needed awareness or political will, if you will, in tackling or taking more seriously the threat of climate change on the continent. Do you agree that this is something that perhaps could be one of the reasons why we're not seeing that level of commitment?
Yes, absolutely. The fiscal space available for African governments is very tight. And governments are at the same time facing a lot of competing priorities. You just said health, education, infrastructure, etc. But at the same time, just for 2014, the cost of disaster risk on the continent was totaled over $53 billion just for 1 year. Just imagine what that means for the for the development of the continent. So, therefore, the continent has really to start thinking about innovative solutions. That's why head of states decided to establish the African Risk Capacity with the objective to help African government to manage and finance disaster risks. The African Risk Capacity combines early warning with well-articulated response plan and financing of those response plans. As of today, 33 countries have signed for African Risk Capacity, and African Risk Capacity has been able in the last 4 years to pay over $37 million to 4 governments to respond to their disaster. But this scheme is not growing as we would have liked it to grow. And this is something we have to work on. And it is possible with the existing resources. I'm not saying new money, but existing resources with the government, the little they have, with the international community, to introduce very innovative financing, for example, through risk transfer and risk pooling. What do I mean? Imagine that out of the almost $20 billion that are being spent every year on disaster risk, If we could take just 10% of that, let's say 2 billion, and we can use it to prepare for disaster, not to wait until disaster happens, and then we start intervening. That means there is a need for $1, we spend $1. Take those 2 billion and invest them in mechanisms like parametric insurance. Then when it triggers, in case of disaster, your $2 billion become $8, $10 billion. In addition, when you intervene early, when disaster occurs, and there is an early intervention, $1 that is spent very early can save the government and the international community up to $4, 5-6 months down the road. So therefore, we have possibilities to start working, but it needs real political will. It needs walking the talk. Africa has decided to do something. Now let's implement it. It means work together. And remember, there is also the effect of solidarity that is really, really significant here. If I go and try to help myself alone, I may need to pay higher amount than if we work together and pool our risk together.
If I could just come in here, let's talk about a recent climate-related disaster incident in the southern African region. I'm talking about Mozambique. Now, incidentally, Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe, 3 countries that are part of the 33 countries that are part of the African risk capacity. So help us understand, because we know that Mozambique in particular is appealing for more international aid. But help us understand, as a member of the African risk capacity, what kind of assistance is Mozambique receiving at this point?
Well, there are several diverse information we are receiving in terms of need. But the reality is that just for relief, because you have 2 phases when there is a strike. First, you help people to cope with what they are having, and then just relief, and then you have the reconstruction phase. But just for relief, there are over $100 million that are requested in order to support the countries, depending on the figures that you meet. Remember that the evaluation is not complete. These are quick evaluations because it is only now humanitarian agencies are having the possibility to have full access to these areas. Not even full access, but I will say better access than the beginning. So again, this happened about 3 weeks ago, if not more now. And if you visit those sites, or if just by seeing what is being shown to us through media, you can see that people are in very, very desperate situation.
Okay, let me ask you this, because part of I was going through the website as African Risk Capacity, and it mentioned that members have access to customized early warning. There's a software that countries can have access to help them detect. So that the response is not reactionary. They can actually at least better prepare for it, as it were. Do any of these countries, 3 countries that were affected, they have access to that early warning software?
All the 3 countries are members of the African Risk Capacity. But to be able to access the full facilities of African Risk Capacity, there is a full process. The first process is to sign the treaty, which they have done, all of them. The second one is to agree through an MOU on a joint working plan, and that joint working plan allows government to access African risk capacity resources for, number 1, training with the software. We have a software that is called Africa Risk View, and that software allows to model your risk, to define your risk profile, allows you to decide what kind of plan you want to implement, and then finally allows you to make a choice in terms of what kind of coverage you want to have regarding the risk and the peril you are facing. With these countries, Malawi itself benefited from our drought program and got a payout 2 years ago. In Zimbabwe, we are very much advanced, and we are practically in the phase of signing a policy, but we hope this will happen in the near future, hoping also with a better fiscal I will say, situation. Regarding Mozambique, we are still discussing, including with the World Bank, to see how the World Bank can support them to get into this scheme. I want to insist on one thing. It is important that we have several countries in this scheme, because that allows to reduce the cost of premiums and diversify the risk.
And speaking about that, why, I mean, just looking at the benefits that the ARC provides, I'm just wondering, there are over 50 countries on the continent. Why just 33 countries at this point? Are you speaking, is the ARC speaking to other countries, telling them about the benefits of being members?
Yes, certainly. ARC is speaking, but you said it at the beginning yourself. This is about also resources, and there are competing priorities in front of governments. So slowly we are moving. Remember, this is only 5 years since African risk capacity is really operating, and we already have 33 countries, and we are working with 20 countries. 15 of those countries have an MOU with us, and we are working actively in all areas of disaster risk management.
All right, Mohamed, we'll just take a quick break. Well, thank you for your time so far. We'll come back and pick up from where we left off. I've been speaking to Mohamed Beavogui. He's the Director General of the African Risk Capacity. We'll continue our discussion right after the break. If you're just joining us, Mohamed Beavogui, Director General, African Risk Capacity, is with me today, and we're discussing how African countries can build resilience to manage climate risks. Mohamed, let's pick up from where we left off. Before we went on a break, you talked about how the ARC is still speaking to other African countries and hopefully getting more members on board. But in the meantime, could you just speak to us on some of the success stories of the ARC with those countries who have benefited, perhaps some scenarios that you could, or some case studies that you can tell us, and how many Africans would you say have benefited so far from the ARC?
Yeah. Number one, the general philosophy of African risk capacity is to build, like its name explains, to build the capacities on the continent. What we are looking for is not bringing experts from outside to do the job for Africans, but maybe bring experts from outside to help Africans to be able to do themselves the risk profiling, the contingency planning, and implementing the financing mechanisms. So the first thing really African risk capacity has done for the 20 countries with which the institution is working out of the 33 that have signed the treaty, is trying to build their own capacity in terms of modeling the climate itself through cutting-edge technology. And we have trained over 3,500 people on the continent in modeling. So, and through that modeling, countries have been able to decide what is the part of the risk profile they want to cover themselves with the mega resources they have, and what part of the risk they are not able to cover, and they have to transfer it on the international market through African risk capacity. And as of today, 8 countries took insurance. I spoke to you about parametric insurance approach that the institution is using. Out of those 8 countries, 4 were hit by drought. I want to emphasize that the first model the government asked us to work on was the drought model, because that is the one that is more frequent and practically always present along the line. So 4 countries, these are Senegal, Mauritania, Niger, and Malawi. They all benefited in the last 4 years in a total of about 37 million. So Senegal alone, when they were hit in 2014, 2015, got 16 million. And nobody heard about the crisis in Senegal, simply because within the next 2 weeks after the declaration of the drought, they received the resources and they could implement an existing plan that was pre-approved already. So, same thing for Mauritania and others. I wanted to say that these countries, and we just finished our governing council, which is, for us, is the COP, is the highest instance of our governance, and all member states expressed their wish to see ARC grow. They made an appeal, they formed a ministerial committee to move around and to sensitize countries, because clearly ARC, African Risk Capacity, is responding to the hope of head of state. But in order for the institution to be able to be really effective, you need larger membership, you need larger participation. Hence, the need to look for how they can pay for their premiums.
Mohamed, help us understand what a typical contingency plan looks like.
The first phase of the cycle, working with ARC, is to determine the risk profile. Let's take the example of drought. What will the model do? The model will pick up the droughts that have occurred in the country or in the region the last 30 years. That means since we have satellite. These are satellite data. And then that will be put together with the population, with the level of poverty, and other aspects. And then that will tell the country that the risk of occurrence of drought is a certain pattern. And then the country, looking at that pattern, will decide what kind of risk it wants to cover. And then once it has decided, for example, that the most dangerous situation may happen, let's say, if 500,000 people in the country are affected, the government will decide, okay, below 200,000 people, we, the government, will put aside our own means to protect people. But above 200,000, we need some extra resources. In the jargon, they say we need to transfer that risk outside of the country. And then at that point, once you have decided that this is the risk you want to transfer outside of that country, you go and insure yourself. One of the places where you can insure yourself is our insurance company, which is a mutualistic insurance company that belongs to member states and which can give you a policy that is based on parametric insurance. Now, that insurance, you can access it only if you have a contingency plan. What is that contingency plan? Is to say, if drought occurs, what do I do? I will have to give people food because they lost their harvest. I'll have to give people animal feed because there is nothing for the animals to eat. I would maybe like to give people just money. That means transfer resources to individuals and to families. So you define exactly how are you going to do that. For example, if it is food, you must be prepared to have done already all the procurement processes, even if they are not implemented, but you know where you get your food and how that food is going to be transported on the field immediately after the peril strikes. In conclusion, you will be able then, when ARC makes its own payout to the government, it allows the government to take the resources and implement an existing plan that was pre-agreed upon.
Mohamed, have you had instances where, apart from capacity and training, where you had to give out money, cash aid to a member country, and despite that, that country it wasn't enough, and it still had to seek outside help? How often does that occur?
Absolutely. I can give you the case of Malawi. 2 years ago, there was a disaster. We gave them the resources, and they decided to use these resources in 2 ways. Number one, to fill their food bank, because the food bank, of course, you can understand, got emptied very quickly. Secondly, they decided simply to distribute the resources through cash transfer. And number one, the ARC resources helped to complement what was being done by the international community. It means ARC resources were not enough. The reason is very simple. The disasters are so big that the government cannot cover all the risks. Even once you have defined your risk profile in general in Africa, that risk profile shows such a magnitude that the government cannot cover it alone. But what is the advantage of the approach ARC is using? As I explained earlier, if you provide $1 to someone who has just entered in a hunger period due to drought, he will take that $1 and buy food. He will not eat the seed he has put aside for next year. He will not sell his agricultural implements, and he will not go for risky coping responses. But if you wait 6 months, 3 months, 6 months down the road, he will sell his implement, he will eat his food, he will take his children out of school, and frequently he will just decide to leave the region and go in the slums of the main cities, or maybe sometime try to cross the Mediterranean or go somewhere else. So that's why $1 you spend at the beginning is like spending over $4 4 to 6 months down the road.
Okay, Mohamed, let me ask you this. So we have about 3 minutes left now. What are your, as Director General of ARC, what are your hopes for this body? Because, you know, climate change is real. Some people, unfortunately, still don't believe it, but here in Africa, we're definitely seeing the effects. And it doesn't matter that the continent contributes least, you know, to it. But what are your hopes? Just 33 countries right now. What are your hopes in terms of how fast you can move in terms of getting more members, getting a bigger a cash vote, as it were, to help you better support African countries?
No, a good question. You may imagine that our dream is to see an Africa that is more protected against disaster risk. Our first objective today is to have more membership. And the biggest constraint is resources. That's why we are working with the African Development Bank through an initiative we have just launched, which is called ADRIFI, African Disaster Risk Financing Facility. We hope that we'll be able to fill the pot of the African Financing Risk Facility to help governments to cover themselves and pay the premiums. We hope that by using that mechanism, governments will be able to join massively, reduce the cost of disaster risk response, and be able to integrate all this easily in their national policies for a long-term sustainability approach. But that is not enough. We are dreaming to have an Africa that is not only responding to disaster risk, but sometimes turning risks as opportunities. We would like to be able to see that green bonds are issued at country level, at regional level, with the help of African Risk Capacity or others, to start also preparing for a better adaptation of our environment to the changing climate. Climate change is there. We are seeing the increase in terms of magnitude and in terms of frequency. So we have to be prepared. And just insurance will not be enough. We'll need to go, yes, quickly with insurance and pulling risks together for solidarity to be able to be more effective, but we need to move even further to bonds and response to the bigger needs that are in front of us.
Mohamed, I must thank you for your time today. Thank you so much for being a part of the program and for sharing that with us. I've been speaking to Mohamed Beavogui, Director General of the African Risk Capacity. Well, that's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of the show on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets. From myself and the team, it's bye for now.